This is a panel that I'm very excited about. When we had the idea to add this, we were going to initially have 3 panels with just a bunch of, experienced academics, we'll say. And Michael suggested that we create an early career panel with the idea that we're bringing all these wonderful people here. It's a great opportunity to take some of the brain power in the room and to provide feedback to some of our very promising PhD students. And so we had Alan Defo actually helped solicit proposals from PhD students, and we're very happy to have 4 panelists join us who are doing, I would say the work on this panel is related to the conference theme, all of it, but the correlation in topics between all of the papers is slightly less than on the first 2 panels, but I think you'll see how all of these are really coming out of the conference theme and are all related to things that we will all recognize as things that are related to things that Natasha would have been interested in. So I'll just say that I'm stalling a little bit until Michael returns. So now he's here. I can let Natalia go. So please, it's my pleasure to introduce Natalia Bueno, who's a PhD student here.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Alan, for organizing this and everybody here. Natasha and I shared a very typical grad student life. We did problem sets together in afternoons, at nights. We took a couple of classes together. Later, I had the pleasure and the challenge of being her TA, and I'm pretty happy to be here. So the paper called Bypassing the Enemy, Distributive Politics, Credit Claiming, and State Organizations in Brazil. It's motivated by something that actually happens pretty frequently in elections. Last year, during Brazil's presidential elections, a question kept coming up. Who deserves credit for Bolsa Familia? So this question came up during debates, interviews, and opposition candidate, Mr. Harrison Neves, he went and argued that the Cardoso administration, his administration from his party, deserved credit for creating this type of conditional cash transfers that are very popular now in Brazil, Bolsa Familia being one of them. Then the sitting president, Dilma Rousseff, came right back and said, well, your administration, Cardoso's administration, has nothing to do with this, and we, the Workers' Party, created Bolsa Familia. But disputes about credit are not just about flagship social policies like Bolsa Familia or just national policies like this one. It's also about everyday politics in terms of social programs that governments carry out at the local level, about public works that governments also carry out. And the question I want to ask here today is, how do incumbents prevent opponents from stealing credit for government programs? So I'm thinking here about government programs in general, especially social welfare programs. And this type of question is usually asked in context of federal systems where overlapping jurisdictions and multiple incumbents create more opportunities for credit hijacking or credit stealing. And the common answer to that question is incumbents strategically allocate federal money to co-partisans at lower levels of governments to minimize potential costs that come with spending resources in place ruled by the opposition. So what they do is, I'm going to transfer more resources, give money to my allies, so the opposition won't have a chance to touch it and steal credit for it. And that evidence has been from many places in the world, such as India, Italy, Brazil, the US, Mexico, and even more centralized places, such as the UK. But still, incumbents might wish to extract political advantage in opposition municipalities. So if you think of a paralyzed system where a huge part of the municipalities are ruled by the opposition, are they just going to leave the opposition ruled places and not extract advantage from those places? And how they can still extract advantage but avoid the risk of credit hijacking when they still spend resources in those opposition municipalities? What I'm going to argue here, there's an alternative. Incumbents can channel resources through non-state welfare providers. Non-state welfare providers in general are religious, charitable organizations, non-state organizations, NGOs, a host of organizations that provide services in many developing countries. These organizations provide services for pretty much all realms of welfare, health, education, assistance, culture, and make up actually a large part of welfare systems in many places. So what I argue is that when they transfer resources, channel resources through these organizations, they minimize the credit hijacking by political foes and reduce the political cost of allocating money there. So in a way, what they're doing here, they're bypassing opposition with those non-state organizations. In a more general way, what you can say here is that partisan alignment between the local incumbent, the mayor, and the central incumbent, the president, affects the incumbents, the central incumbents, the president, distributive strategies. And this yields two predictions. One, more common in the literature that has been found elsewhere, is that the election of a co-partisan mayor, an aligned mayor, causes the central government to favor the mayor with public funds. So what I've said before, you are going to favor your allies, your co-partisans. But the election of an opposition mayor has the opposite effect. It causes the central government to shift resources, to change resources to private charities that operate in the municipality. So here the effect of alignment is that alignment causes a decrease in transfer to non-state organizations. So these are the two predictions that I'm going to look at with data from Brazil, and I'm going to use here closed-race continuity design. I'm not going to really discuss that in detail, but I'm happy to take questions about it too. So here I'm going to look at budget data. So all budget data from Brazil on transfers from 2003 to 2011. And the first plot is something that papers have shown before, and I just showed here with different data. I'm kind of in a way replicating what they did. And as you can see here, you have a jump at where the president party wins, showing that whenever the president party wins, you get more money to mayors. And the other plot is kind of the mirror image. So where the president party wins, you get less money going to non-state organizations and more money going to non-state organizations where the president party loses. So I'm just showing you here both predictions that I made. This picture is just to illustrate, but of course, if you can look at this in many different ways, and results kind of hold. But this is just identifying the effect of alignment. So I'm arguing here, just to review, that whenever an opposition mayor wins, I'm going to send more money to non-state organizations there. I'm going to bypass opposition there. And I argue that this is because they're trying to avoid credit hijacking. It's not about corruption. It's not about clientelism. It's credit hijack. It's electoral logic. So how can I actually show that mechanism? And here, I'm going to look at this in different ways. But the key prediction is that voters give local incumbents less credit for services provided by non-state organizations compared to services administered by mayors, even when these are the same services and both funded with federal money. And I'm going to show this here first. I do a survey experiment with an online sample of Brazilian voters, and I do two designs, a conjoint design and a vignette design. And the first one is respondents going to see two municipalities that vary in terms of the type of welfare provider, so if it's an NSP or city government with and without federal funds, the mayor's partisanship, and the joint provision, whether or not it's local and federal. That's just to make it more liberal and concrete. That's what they're going to see. You have two municipalities, A and B, and they vary in terms of who's providing services to them, basically, and where the money comes from. And then they answer questions about which mayor they prefer. And here, what you should be looking at, mostly, there's a bunch of things I could say here. I'm just going to focus on two, is whenever there's a non-state provider, the unaligned mayor has a decrease in their evaluation. So even when funds come from the federal government, the non-state provider reduces the mayor's evaluation. And I measure that in two ways. So here what I'm basically trying to show to you is that non-state welfare provision, it is reducing mayor evaluation. It's reducing how popular the mayor is. And another way to look at this, I'm just talking about mayor evaluation here, but I didn't really get at credit, is I'm showing here to survey respondents a vignette about welfare provision. So they read the short vignette in which I vary who is responsible for welfare provision. Is it a non-state provider? So I just give them a name of a charity, and where do the funds come from? And in places where they see, and the other option is that they see that the city is in charge of providing that service, and whether or not funds come from the federal government. After that, I asked them, in your opinion, your personal opinion, who is responsible for these improvements in the Center for Elderly People? I had a question about elderly care. And as you can see, whenever the city provides services, as we expected, mayor gets attributed most of the responsibility. But when the non-state provider is in charge of that services, mayor gets a lot less responsibility, and the director of the organization itself gets a lot of the responsibility. And also, in non-state providers in general, you see a lot of more distribution in terms of who gets assigned responsibility for that type of service. And also, similar to what I found before, whenever we ask them about how they evaluate the mayor based on that information, based on the vignette, we also see a decrease in mayor evaluation when public goods provision is done by a charity, by a private provider. And, well, there's much more I could say about this, and this is actually a part that Natasha had some influence on. We talked about this paper some time ago, and she's the one that suggested me to don't look at just voters' perceptions, also look at how elites behave. So she kind of had this idea of, that I implemented later, of web scraping credit claiming events. So just look at places where mayors can have a chance to claim credit, such as ribbon cutting ceremonies and things like that. So I did it, and I basically found again here that those events, whenever it's in a private charity, they're just harder for the mayor to claim credit. These events are they're farther away from this David Mayhew description of credit claiming, in which there's a sole claimant making sure that he's assigned responsibility for something. In these types of events, in charities, it's much harder for the mayor to do that. And I can talk more about that later. Anyway, in the paper I also discussed that it's not really a story about clientelism and corruption. I don't really find evidence of that, and I looked at that through different ways. And importantly, this doesn't mean that these organizations are neutral. They have partisan affiliation. They have political opinions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to engage in clientelism or corruption. So to conclude, this is a part of a larger project on delegation of welfare services. And the basic question is, if service provision pays off for incumbents, why would they ever delegate it? Why would they ever pass on services provision to third-party organizations? And here I developed a theory of delegation to those organizations. I look at different ways, and mostly in the cases of Brazil and Chile. So thank you. My time is up.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So thank you for sticking around for the afternoon food coma session. It's really an honor to be here in many respects. So Susan mentioned that I come from a different angle to this. This was a coded word for saying I'm a political theorist. I do things that most of you don't do, and vice versa. And it's an honor to be here, partly because major part because Natasha, part of her tremendous intellectual curiosity was that even though normative political philosophy was not in any way the focus of her work, she was tremendously interested in what it has to say about, well, virtually anything in the world. She volunteered to comment on papers in the political theory workshop we have here at Yale that political philosophers themselves were afraid to comment on. And she knew nothing about, and she was very honest about it, but she nonetheless stepped up to talk about them. And we had many conversations on the themes that I'm going to talk about for the next 9 minutes or so. So it's great to have this opportunity in this way. So the paper that we're going to present today, often I think when we have moments of honesty for ourselves, our papers that we come to present we feel confident and happy about and feel like they're going in the right way and we're happy with how they look. This is not one of them. I'm very displeased with the shape of my paper. There are many reasons for this, and I feel almost guilty for inflicting the paper on poor Michael. But these reasons will come out shortly. So the paper is titled National Ownership with Cosmopolitan Intent. And the focus of the paper is on comparing the merits and demerits of two proposals that philosophers have given much attention to in recent years, both of which concern natural resource wealth and the political economy of natural resource wealth. So for the last 40 years or so, there's been tremendous interest in political philosophy in questions of global distributive justice, global economic reform, and a major part of that interest, insofar as it concerned extreme poverty, in particular, is concerned natural resources. The instinctive thought that much of this philosophical literature, especially in its early stages in the 1970s onwards, the instinctive original impulse, if you want, was that natural resources are an especially interesting source of wealth with which to think about the amelioration of global poverty, because of the idea that they are morally arbitrary. That is, no way cannot say we worked really hard for there to spring up oil accidentally in our territory. Societies may claim moral value, if you want, or there's a moral credence to their claim to their human capital, but not to the natural capital they just happen to find as a matter of natural accidents. Now, this was a major source of this philosophical impulse for thinking, why can't we take something like money from the sovereign wealth fund of Norway and use it to tap into poverty amelioration in, say, Bangladesh? A big part of what I try to do in this paper is to take the relevant social science literature and say the picture is more complicated. And the picture ultimately suggests that there's another reform that's tied to natural resource wealth that's very tied to the conversations in this room today that should be our focus and is actually a better fit with a lot of intuitions. And also, when a competition between these two reforms, the latter reform should prevail. And the latter reform focuses not, as in the former case, on humanity's claims to the Earth's natural resource wealth. It's not to say the people of Bangladesh should have some kind of moral stake in the oil that happens to be found under Norway's territorial waters, but rather it is to say, for example, the oil of Equatorial Guinea belongs to the people of Equatorial Guinea, not to the dictator that rules Equatorial Guinea. Congo's diamonds belong to the people of Congo, not to the civil warriors who turn them into blood diamonds, and so on and so forth. Now, you can immediately see a potential conflict here because one reform is based on some idea of national ownership. This is the people's property. The prior reform is based on the idea of humanity's property. So much of what the paper tries to do is to think about this conflict. And one way to do that is to think for the relevant social science literature. The initial cosmopolitan impulse for thinking about this kind of global redistribution of natural resource wealth as a way of tapping into poverty was to say, as I mentioned, that this wealth is morally arbitrary. Nations cannot claim some kind of moral desert to this wealth, but the social science literature complicates this picture. Why? Well, presumably because the Norwegians, for example, can say, yes, we don't deserve, morally speaking, capital D, to have found oil within our territory, but the fact that we made it into a blessing rather than a curse is a result of our institutions and our hard work to shape the right kind of institutions. And if that's true, then this kind of moral arbitrariness idea does much less work than you think it does. Another problem with moral arbitrariness arguments generally is that if you run with the moral arbitrariness line all the way through and say that societies ought to carry the responsibility for circumstances that are within their control, what you're really saying is that if you can trace extreme poverty even to chosen voluntary decisions, then everyone is off the hook. It's your fault. You got yourself into this mess. You deal with it now. So it's part of the reason I try to move away from this cosmopolitan proposal, and much of the brunt of the paper is to show that these two proposals are in conflict, that they don't align very well together. We need to choose between them. And the proposal is that we choose the one that's based on national ownership, on saying this is the oil of Equatorial Guinea, for example, not of Theodore Obiang, partly because that latter reform is much more structural. It's not based on an injection of foreign wealth into the country, holding institutions fixed with all the familiar problems of the effectiveness of aid and so on and so forth. Rather, it's trying to change political conditions. It's saying the emphasis is on taking the wealth out of the country, not on bringing it in. So if you could send Obiang to exile and his billions of dollars with him, but have more effective institutions, that will be better. Right? There are a lot of moving parts in the argument, and the main reason I'm very displeased with the current version is that it relies tremendously on a very heterodox argument that I've elaborated at length in another article about the nature of property and the nature of taxation. What a lot of the cosmopolitan people who are kind of my foil in this paper try to say is like, look, we don't dispute national ownership. All we're saying is we're going to tax some very small portion of, say, Norwegian oil and use it for the world's purposes. Why is that a threat to Norwegian ownership of natural resource wealth? And there's a complex philosophical argument there where I try to say that every claim of taxation embodies some kind of claim of deep ownership over the resource that's being taxed. So the provocative thesis is, when the US government is taking away 40% of your tax income at the end of the month, it's in some deep way claiming some deep ownership over your entire tax income. That's the libertarian fear. But I spent a lot of my intellectual time trying to dispel that fear. Since I have 2 minutes left, I'm just going to say very briefly some of the smaller points that kind of feature in the paper, and also some of my concerns about how to make it better or stop it from getting worse, which seems to be getting with time as more objections pile up in the text. Disaster. So one point I try to make, I try to appeal to some kind of opportunity cost in the way we think about how we prioritize across different reforms. Philosophers tend to kind of sit back in their sofas and say, well, we need to do A, B, and C, and D, and basically a trillion things, and rarely we stop to think about, well, what do we do first? Or where should we allocate our scarce political capital, economic capital? Part of what I try to say is that go again to the kind of moral arbitrariness idea. If natural resources don't hold any distinctive advantage in the kind of moral arbitrariness category, if anything, they might have liabilities because of this social science background we discussed. You might be better off opportunity cost-wise tapping into things like the morally arbitrary inheritances of extremely affluent individuals. That might be an equally morally effective way to think about tapping into poverty. I have 0 minutes?
You have 1.
1 minute. So what am I going to do with 60 seconds? What I will say very quickly is that a big part of my concern, and I flagged this in the paper I uploaded to the conference website, is that this might just be a kind of classic junior concern. When you're a senior, you can just tell the editor, trust me, I get it covered. This provocative claim about taxation and what does it mean to tax, what kind of claim of ownership is involved in a taxation system, is a claim that I elaborate in basically another 30-page paper that's dedicated exclusively to that idea. And I worry that if I chuck it out of the paper, then a big part of the argument goes away. If I keep it in the paper, then people will say, this is crazy, this is contested territory, you need to have a whole paper exactly on that. Which I do, but what I do. So I welcome your suggestions. Thank you for your time, and thank you again for coming.
Perfect. Exactly right on time.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting Natasha personally, but I feel like it was just a matter of time before we met since the small world of political science and our affiliations to both Yale and Columbia. So I'm presenting this paper that I've been working with Paul Lagunas for the last almost like year and a half or so, and it's titled Dynamic Transparency. It's a study of Mexico's Freedom of Information Act, and we talk a lot in this paper, we talk a lot about a topic that has come up throughout the day, which is transparency. It has been mentioned several times how transparency distorts a lot of like the negotiations going on, and it allows people to hide a lot of the malfeasance that's going on. So precisely because of that, there has been a lot of a big surge on FOIA laws, Freedom of Information Acts, to promote more public access to information. And there have also been a small industry of studies trying to evaluate the impact of these FOIAs on indicators like corruption and governance and perceptions of corruption. The results are very mixed, and so we decided to take a step back before evaluating the impact of a program. Well, let's figure out if one of the most ambitious FOIAs in the world, which is Mexico's, well, let's see if it actually works. So that's our guiding question here. We're testing Mexico's FOIA law. And this law has been in action since 2002 at the federal level, and since then there have been several reforms that have expanded it to the state level. So it now covers more of Mexican jurisdictions. And at the time when it was passed, there was a lot of expectation that it was going to pass and corruption was going to disappear and it's going to do wonders for Mexico. And if you keep up with news from Mexico, you probably know that that's not true. So that further motivated our study to see if, hey, is this law actually working? So those are our guiding questions, and we look at what we did. I'll jump to the research design first, since because of time. So what we did, we did almost like a letter study, hidden shopper kind of thing, where we sent FOIA requests to all the federal offices in Mexico in 3 years, in 2007, 2013, and 2015. All of the requests were asking for the same information. There were 14 questions, and they were all sent from the same person in those 3 years. From an average identity, it was basically a Joe Smith asking for information, a regular citizen who wanted to know more about the government. And that allowed us to do this observational study across the years to see how the offices performed through time. And in addition, we included an experiment in 2007 where half of the requests were sent from an influential identity, from a citizen who was signaling a lot of wealth and a lot of political connections and clout. So we wanted to see if there was any difference in the way that offices replied to a seemingly influential identity or to just your regular Joe Smith who wanted to know something about government. And there have been other studies that are in this spirit that have they've basically audited the IFAI, or INAI now, which is the national agency at the federal level in charge of promoting transparency and resolving transparency disputes. They all have used administrative data from INAI, so they all just get a bulk of the data that they have and see how the agencies answer. And a lot of these studies have focused on a lot of the the top 5 biggest agencies that receive requests. So we try to build on these studies by looking at a longer time period and by looking systematically at all of the agencies that receive information requests. So the requests we sent, as I said, had 14 questions. 10 of the questions asked for information that's obviously public. You can find it online, so it's like a copy of the payroll sheet of the office, copies of contracts that they've signed with other people, and 4 of the questions were more personal questions. They asked for a copy of the director's disclosure, like wealth disclosure. They asked if the person in charge of the office had other family members in government, what was their salary at their previous job, and if they could provide us with their personal email address. So these 4 last questions, they were more sensitive questions. There's a bit of ambiguity in terms of whether they should be providing this. Should we know who in their family is in government? So we tried to see how they answered to that. Surprisingly, there were some, I'm jumping ahead of it, but there were some agencies that answered to every single question, even their personal email address, aunts and uncles in government, all that information. So as a good result, as I mentioned, we looked at things like how long they took to reply to our requests, whether they actually answered the request when they gave a reply to the information request, whether they charge a fee, the number of pages provided, and the number of questions responded. Those were the main variables we looked at across the years. Encouragingly, we find that there's an increase in the number of information requests answered from 2007 to 2015. So more and more offices are responding to the request. We do find that they're taking longer to reply, which that can go both ways. That can mean they're being more diligent, they need to go look for that information and to be able to give it, or maybe they're giving you more information, so they need more time to give it to you. On the other hand, it could also be a way to stall the response. Maybe if we wait till the last time, the citizen will get tired and they'll stop nagging us about this information. One worrying thing that we saw was that there was an increase in the fees that were being charged. So in Mexico, the offices can charge a fee to give you information. This is not a bribe, it's just a way to pay for the copies that you ask, or if you want them to be sent via mail, to cover those costs. We think that that's a bit problematic because it's a very burdensome task to pay that fee. You can't do it online. You have to go to a specific bank to pay it. So it does seem like a way to kind of like block access to that information, especially because all of this information is online, and a lot of the other offices provided everything in a PDF via email without charging anything. We also looked at the quality of the information request. So we focus on 3 of the questions that we asked, which is the copies of contracts, if they provided a payroll sheet or not, and the CV of the agency director. And we don't really see a pattern in terms of improvement or lack of improvement in terms of quality. So from our quality assessment, we basically conclude that they basically stayed at the same level in terms of quality throughout the years. For the excuses, we looked at some general excuses that had been identified before by other papers, and we also saw that came up consistently in the responses that we were receiving. Common excuses were like claiming that they didn't have the information, or asked to make individual requests for each question, or telling the citizen, hey, the information is found elsewhere, go ask this other agency. So we do find some important changes in the use of these excuses. For me, the most surprising was one for making individual requests. It was used all the time in 2007. Like, often people we would get the response saying, like, send your 14 questions as 14 separate information requests, which it's nowhere in the law, so it's obviously made up by them. And then by 2013, 2015, it had disappeared. No one used it. We also see decreases in the use of the excuse of confidential information, and in saying that the information was found elsewhere. So this is encouraging because it reflects sort of a maturity of the system, that either they know how to archive the information better so they can find it better when it's being asked, or they know how to classify the information between confidential and not confidential better. But there's still a lot of other things that, for example, claiming that the information does not exist. That's a very common excuse, and we don't see any important changes here about that, even though we know that information is out there because it's public. And in terms of the experiment that we embedded into the study, this is also very encouraging, that both the average and the influential person were treated basically the same in terms of the quality of their responses, the time they took to get a reply from the government, whether they got an answer or not. The only difference we find between the two is that the influential person got charged a fee more often than the average ID person. This was, I guess it's not so surprising from the laughter it elicited, but it's a bit hard to interpret what this means. Is it that they're taxing the rich man? Are they, trying maybe charge so that they can give him better service? So there's a bit of ambiguity in terms of interpreting that one finding. So is it working? Well, most of the times, about 70% of the times, we do find that, or about 80% of the times actually by 2015, that you do get a response. So most of the times you do get a response. You won't get a response to all of the questions, and you'll get some creative excuses from the government as well. And in terms of quality, since we don't see any big changes, you might not be as happy with the responses that you get, but at least you'll hear back from them and get something back. And there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, especially in looking at cases, for example, like the excuses used and the confidential information, so better archive practices and keeping track of all that information as well. And that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. So I'm the last presenter of the day. So it's just me and T, basically. I didn't know Natasha very well, but we worked together on a conference that we put together last year in Kenya. And I think it's really appropriate that this is being done in her honor, because she really believed in bringing people together, and she was a real connector. And also that ideas shouldn't just be buried in journals, but should be out there. So my talk today will examine how biased perceptions of the global income distribution shape preferences for cross-national redistribution in the United States. Rising inequality in the US and other developed countries is the subject of noisy debate and a growing body of scholarship. But in many ways, international disparities of income and wealth dwarf inequality within the countries of the developed world. So this is a chart of the global income distribution put together by the charity Giving What We Can, and it's based on household income and consumption surveys aggregated by Branko Milanovic and the World Bank. And what it shows, basically, is that even the struggling lower and middle classes of countries like the US are actually in the top decile of the global income distribution. And in fact, Milanovic uses a Romerian equality of opportunity framework and finds that the country you're born in accounts for about half the variation in expected lifetime earnings. Obviously, it's a matter of luck where you're born. Okay, and even if you think that international inequality is a problem, and for a variety of reasons you may not, you may feel that talking about international redistribution is a little bit putting the cart before the horse. But actually, such redistribution already takes a variety of forms, including foreign aid programs, which are just a sliver of OECD's budget expenditures, but are still a meaningful sum in many of the receiving countries. Charitable contributions that amount to about $19 billion in the US, that's about 6% of the total giving. And a whole range of other issues, related to intellectual property rights regimes and immigration flows. All these kinds of things have significant ramifications for the distribution of income and wealth around the world. Nevertheless, many programs and policies that redistribute income from rich countries to poor countries are very unpopular. Over 60% of Americans believe that the US spends too much on foreign aid. The Kaiser Family Foundation believes in part that this is due to misinformation. The average American believes that 28% of the US federal budget is spent on foreign aid. Other people have pointed out explanations related to ethnocentrism, the appropriateness of government action abroad, concerns about efficiency and corruption, and so forth. I want to offer an alternative explanation, which is grounded in the idea that citizens of rich countries systematically misperceive how rich they are in relative terms to the citizens around the world. To understand why rich world citizens come to have these biased perceptions, I had drawn a theoretical framework developed by Krusas et al. And applied it to the international context. The central idea is that individuals make naive extrapolations from their own peer groups and apply it to make inferences about the full income distribution. And if they fail to apply Bayes' rule properly, they'll arrive at a range of biased estimates related to a bunch of statistics. And we should thus observe individuals systematically overestimating the global median income and underestimating their rank in the global income distribution. Now, in developing a framework for understanding individuals' preferences for international redistribution, note that individuals face two salient trade-offs. The first trade-off is between their own income and the income of other people, and the second trade-off is whether income that's redistributed should be spent either at home or abroad. And in both cases, individuals have both self-interested and altruistic reasons for why they might support redistribution abroad. They might fear the spread of poverty, disease, war, and terrorism, and so they might feel that expenditures abroad are a good way to spend their money. Or they might have more altruistic considerations, and a large literature has documented that this, in fact, has been an important component of foreign aid programs and other kinds of programs. So I think that for both these altruistic and self-interested reasons, that providing individuals with information about the global income distribution is likely to motivate them to support higher levels of international distribution. But, of course, these effects are likely to be heterogeneous by people's beliefs and outlooks, their partisanship, with their beliefs about the efficiency of redistribution, their beliefs about the relative low role of luck and effort in determining a person's life outcomes, and so forth. The design that I'm going to use to test these hypotheses is very simple. I have a nationally representative sample. It's a high-quality sample of about 1,500 Americans, and 1/3 of them are assigned to a pure control group, 1/3 of them are assigned to just estimate the rank and median in the global income distribution, and 1/3 is both asked to estimate these statistics and then subsequently given information about these statistics. That middle group is just going to be a kind of placebo group that's just going to identify the effect of priming the salience of these issues in respondents' minds. Okay, and this is about this is what the median respondent receives. The median respondent is the top 5% of the global income distribution, and that's the kind of information treatment. So they get their rank, the median, and the incomes at the 80th and 20th percentiles. So this is the first result. Now this graph basically plots respondents' actual rank in the global income distribution versus their estimated rank. And if you're making accurate guesses, so if most respondents are making accurate guesses, almost everyone would be along the 45-degree line, okay? But in fact, about 71% of respondents underestimate their rank in the global income distribution. The median respondent believes that she is in the 63rd percentile of the global income distribution when she, in fact, is in the 95th percentile. So that's the first result. This is the second result. Americans, or this is a representative sample of Americans, the median American believes that the global median income is $20,000 a year, when it's actually $2,100 per year. So what that means is that close to 80% of the sample basically overestimates the median income. I then, after giving people this information, I studied their attitudes towards foreign aid, tariffs and subsidies for agricultural goods, and charitable giving. And this is the first question. People are told about 1% of the US federal budget is spent on non-military economic aid to foreign countries. Would you say that the US now spends too much, too little, or about the right amount? And they were given these 5 options. Too much, and they would like to send a petition to their senator requesting that this aid be reduced. Too much, about the right amount. Too little, and I would like to send an email petition to my senator requesting that this aid be increased. Okay? So here's this first result. So I want you to focus on column 2. And 12% of the control group believes that the US foreign aid budget should be increased. Okay? That percentage rises to 22%. So there's a 10 percentage point difference once you give people this information. The placebo group is about in the middle, so there's a 6 percentage point difference there. But more soberingly, pretty much no one is willing to send a petition to actually make this happen. The other question I asked people was about U.S. agricultural tariffs and subsidies, and I asked people whether they think that these import taxes and subsidies should be reduced. And here again, if you look at column 2, the percentage of people who think that the U.S. should reduce these agricultural tariffs and subsidies rises from about 43% to about 50%. There's a little bit more action here in terms of whether people are willing to write to their congressman to change this policy. Okay, here's I think what the most interesting result is. I told people that approximately 10% of you will be randomly selected to receive a cash bonus of $20. If you were to be selected, you may keep the entire amount or choose to donate a percentage of the payment to either a charity that provides food, cash, or education or medical aid to recipients in the US, or food, cash, or medical aid to recipients living abroad. And 10% of them were actually selected. So 90% of people are making a hypothetical choice, and 10% are actually making a choice with real money in a sense. And I asked people, I gave them a 3-way choice. They could keep the entire amount, or they could donate a fraction to a charity providing aid in the US or a charity providing aid abroad. Okay, so this is what the control group does. The control group keeps 62% of the money. It donates 28% to a charity in the US and 10% to a charity abroad. What happens in the treatment group is that they keep about 54% of the money. They donate a little bit more to US charities, and basically charitable giving rises in this group by 55%. That is that they keep they donate about 16% to charities abroad. Great. And moreover, this is quite broad-based. So the percentage of people who make a positive contribution rises from 30% to about 42%. And what this meant, so these survey experiments, we know from the related literature that they have a very short half-life in the sense that the change in behavior is relatively short-lived. But at least in this experiment, what happened was that charitable giving rose from $122 in the control group to charities like Medsource, Soft Frontier, and others, to $196 in the treatment group. So that's a pretty significant difference. In order to get at the mechanisms, I asked people 2 questions. In the past year, not including today, have you donated any money to an organization that supports the poor? And the idea is that randomization ensures that this proportion is going to be identical across the groups. So it's a measure of social desirability bias. And then I asked people whether the rich have a responsibility to help the poor to find out if they are acting in accordance with some kind of norm. And here too, I find no significant differences across the groups. So I think that this is highly suggestive evidence that we can reject social desirability bias and generalized norm priming as the main mechanisms through which the treatment operates, and instead, I think it suggests that people are updating and they are learning about these issues. I believe that it contributes, the theory and empirical results that are developed in this paper contribute to several tributaries of research in the social sciences. One is a growing body of research that measures misperceptions of income and wealth in a domestic context. I extend this research to the international context. Another related body of research basically uses this set of studies and integrates these subjective perceptions into people's preferences for redistribution more broadly. It also speaks to new literature on foreign aid and international redistribution and public opinion about it. And finally, it speaks to a growing body of research on preferences for redistribution using experiments. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. These are 4 really exciting papers that, even though they cover a lot of different territory in their interests and their focus and their methods, I think all sort of capture some dimension of Natasha's interests. And so that makes it a fun group to put together, especially for today. Let me give some comments to each of the presenters in the order in which the papers were presented. So the Bueno paper regarding federalism and credit claiming in Brazil. So this is a very cool paper that sort of joins this growing body of research that takes Brazil as the great laboratory for the study of federalism, right? That the system has certain properties that make it especially good for researchers. And so it's nice that it's contributing to a body of research that is already there and sort of thickens our knowledge. And the topic is really, it's interesting and it's nicely framed in the paper. When I first read it, this question about, or rather the point made that presidents will give more money to districts through an NGO when the district is controlled by an opposition member than they will if it's controlled by a co-partisan. At first I thought, well, okay, but it seems kind of specific to Brazil. And then I looked at the newspaper and saw the big fight about Planned Parenthood donations and how partisan that is. And I thought, well, actually, this really does have pretty big scope. The finding seems intuitively appealing, and it's one thing that I especially liked about the paper is that it does a very good job of acknowledging and trying to capture the complexity of the Brazilian setting and the federal system there. And I'm not, by any means that familiar with it. So please take that into account. But I still came away not fully convinced that the argument was right. I thought my comments would be about the external validity of this particular case, but I found myself also wondering about the internal validity and whether this had really been nailed down. So first of all, it seems odd to me that even though you see this effect in, I guess, municipalities, I said districts, but municipalities that are controlled by the opposition, you don't see this when it is an opposition coalition or when it's a government-supporting coalition. And that didn't seem to kind of intuitively fit the story. It also seemed odd to me in a way that NGO funding increases when the opposition takes power in a given area. You would think that the government might want to decrease the net funding going to a given municipality when it's controlled by the opposition, not just directly to the mayor, but also through other channels. In fact, if you are a simple retrospective voter and you see that all this additional money is coming into your district through the NGOs, I think actually things are kind of better when the opposition's in power. In fact, you could even take it a step further. Let's assume that an opposition voter gets no patronage when a government-aligned mayor is in power, but gets some chunk of patronage when the opposition is in power. Okay? Well, if it's true that you get something from the mayor when the opposition mayor is in power, and you get even more money through an NGO, you're really better off continuing to vote for the opposition. So it didn't seem like it kind of overall made as much sense as I was hoping, and that all of the different indications were sort of pointing in the same direction as to the sort of consistency of the story. Still, it's a sophisticated paper. It's an interesting paper. It's got a cool research design. I felt like I was in good hands as I was reading it, and I appreciated the fact that the results are all really pretty clearly presented. And so it doesn't take too much effort to sort of see that, okay, this is messy in the way the real world is, in fact, messy. So, okay. The paper by Nili. So he modestly apologizes for making me read this because it's a theory paper, but I think he's really being exceptionally modest because it is a really engaging and provocative paper. And I've tried to read some number of theory papers. I won't tell you how many in the last, say, 5 or 10 years. But this is one that I just kept getting sort of drawn further. And it's really a tribute to the clarity, both the clarity of the argument, his willingness to sort of engage with people who do empirical research, and his kind of, I think, perhaps instinct just to be provocative, to say things that will kind of make us think it might go against the grain. And in its simplest version, this seems like a really a sensible and important point, which is that he wants to bring the sort of findings of the resource curse literature together with this literature on distributive justice globally, and to kind of address this anomaly that people advocating for distributive justice globally think that somehow countries that through accident have natural resource wealth are advantaged, and that something should be done about that. Whereas in fact, if you take the kind of most severe interpretation of the resource curse, that you are really absolutely worse off, in fact, the opposite should be true. In fact, if you want to make the real countries whose deficits by accident we should address are the ones that have all the oil and mineral resources and the alluvial diamonds. So he approaches, he has an intuition, I think, about this contradiction, and I'm excited by how well he brings together the sort of theory component and the empirical research. That said, I think he goes too far, and this again is, I wouldn't say this if I didn't think it was sort of a tribute to the lucidity of the argument. I think he goes too far in that he runs this sort of counterfactual experiment. What would happen if some of the natural resource wealth from the resource-rich countries was transferred to impoverished countries that don't have resource wealth? They would have, as a result, also kind of a resource curse. They would be suffering the same way that countries currently are. But I think that's a little bit too literal in reading the claims about distributive justice. That is, not having read it, but I doubt that Poggi and others are really arguing that you should bring about distributive justice by taking literally tankers full of oil and moving them from Saudi Arabia to, some impoverished country. The claim is not, that you redistribute the natural resource wealth itself. I assume it is probably that you take the revenue generated by the sale of these assets, and then in some manner you transfer them to impoverished countries. And there's no reason why you couldn't transfer them in a way that is, beneficial. Maybe there's some direct distribution, or you find some way to subsidize healthcare or education or infrastructure in these countries. You want to abstract away from the issue of foreign aid effectiveness, which seems appropriate. But this seems to me like a much more straightforward interpretation of the global redistribution claim, and I felt like you gave it short shrift. Okay. The Lagunas Pocasangre paper. So this goes to the critical question, and I know that people here who work on the practical dimensions of these issues, including Jenik and Pasha and many others, and Susan, know that it is a really urgent question before us whether transparency is actually reducing corruption. And as Paul alluded to in his prior comments, it's not at all obvious from the literature. So this seems to me to be a step towards addressing in a very careful way this issue in the Mexican context, specifically around the FOIA law. So the basic research design is very cool, and I think, if anything, the presentation underplayed some of the really impressive aspects of this, like the fact that they ran this thing 3 times over an 8-year period. How often do you get a project in our field that takes samples at at these long intervals? It's also, I thought, the treatment design, the way that the different letters, one from an alleged privileged citizen and one from a sort of more average citizen, the way that class signals were encoded in the letter was just really clever. And they went really, I mean, they took all these extra steps, creating fake websites and stuff like this to try to make these claims credible. So I love that, and I thought, what a great hypothesis to test. Okay. And again, we didn't get this from the presentation, but my heart goes out to Paul and Oscar, because at this point in their study, they fell upon a tremendous misfortune, which he didn't really fully reveal, which is that all their results are good news, okay? And that tends to make for less alarming and publication-friendly, at least in the most obvious way, results, okay? It's good news that actually compliance with FOIA is increasing, and not so bad to begin with as a baseline, but actually increasing. It's impressive to me that the treatment of a letter from some privileged person, that treatment has no effect on the response rate. Government agencies are responding regardless of what they can infer about the claimant, the questioner, from the letter. And in fact, it's perhaps even better news that there's sort of a progressive tax on the privileged letter writers. Since they are charged a little bit more money in a perfect world, I would prefer that. Why shouldn't we fund this from because the letter writers sort of suggest they're a business consultant, so they might have sort of a financial interest in these answers, and hence why not? So so that is the that, it seems to me, is the bottom line in the result. The paper is presented in a very clear way, in a very admirable way. The analysis is sensitive to all kinds of potential problems, but the research design is clean enough that they really, I think, are dealt with kind of before the research takes place. And so I'm going to say something to them that I think I have never, ever said before in my life to anybody whose paper I've reviewed, which is that you do too good a job in your analysis and too good a job in framing the argument, okay? Meaning that the design and the results are so clear and well organized that you don't need a 30-page paper to present them. And I felt like there was sort of a lot of kind of backfilling and, context setting that turned out to be really unnecessary, which is, I think, a tribute to a good research design. And also, you get these positive results. So I think this is a great paper. I think it's almost perfectly suited to one of the newer journals that publishes short pieces reporting results. It's essentially some of it is sort of a null result, that this treatment of the privileged letter writer has no effect, and so they're sort of especially friendly to that. This I think is actually a sign of a really well-designed and well-executed research project, that it can be summarized in a handful of pages and it has an interesting finding, even if it does happen to be good news. Okay. Finally, the Nair paper. So this is a very polished paper. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it's currently under review or has been submitted. No? Okay. Well, it is pretty darn close to that stage. It's a great idea. It's one of those that once you read it, you think, God, it makes so much sense. Hasn't anybody ever done this before? Hasn't anybody ever established this or asked this question in a sort of in a careful way? Hasn't anybody seen whether this has an effect, helping people realize where we are in the global distribution of income on people's views about foreign aid and U.S. policy? So, and the findings are interesting. In some sense, they're kind of what you'd expect. Okay, yes, Americans have no idea about this. They don't have much appreciation for how we are indeed at the top of the income distribution globally. But it's still startling and interesting just how big a difference there is between the reality and the perception. And that alone, even though it's simply a description of a survey result, to me was worth the price of reading the paper. That was really... I also will say that I found the single most encouraging piece of the paper was you're finding that those respondents with college educations were significantly better in estimating where we stood in the global income distribution. So college educations are not completely useless. They do something to perhaps give people a better understanding of where we stand with respect to other countries. I do have one concern about the paper, which is that I think it doesn't present as candidly as it should the mixed results of the treatment in terms of whether people are willing to take costly actions or not. Now, the presentation, I thought, did do a good job of that. But if you read the abstract and you read the introduction, you would think that the effects of this are tremendous and really consequential for people's willingness to undertake costly action to promote more foreign aid or write their legislator. The treatment in all kinds of ways, the more I sort of read into the paper, the more I realized you were reporting, well, there's actually this test and there was not a result here, or there's no significant effect here, there was no significant effect there, was no. So actually there were many, but there was a non-trivial number of tests to see whether treatments mattered. Often they did not. Sometimes the significance level of the treatment was, I thought, marginal, and perhaps a little bit weaker than you might have been implying, and it was also striking, for example, that the treatment didn't have any effect on people's beliefs about redistribution within the United States, which you might think and hope it would have. Now, none of this impugns the value of the study. If anything, it casts even more light on the findings. I mean, this is trivial and obvious to say, but null results are every bit as informative as so-called significant results. And I would not hesitate at all to present those up front the way you did in the presentation. But in any case, this seems like a very mature paper that is well on the way to being placed at a very good journal. All the papers are interesting. All of them bear reading. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. There's something among these papers for everyone in their breadth, and it's a pleasure to be part of the discussion on them. So.
Great. So with that, I'd actually like to open it up for questions from the audience. I saw Paul first and then over here. So go ahead. Oh, I forgot. Allow me to give you this, and then maybe you can give it to the next person. That's supposed to be sharing too.
So my question's for Natalia. There's a bullet point that stuck out for me, and it's this one where you clarify that your story is not about corruption or clientelism. And however, you need to make the clarification. You feel compelled to make the clarification. Instead of dodging that and sort of saying that's not within the scope of your study, I wonder what if you engaged that question and actually saw what the links are. It seems perhaps it may have something to do with there's something not totally honest about the approach. I don't know. The point is, I would, rather than dodge it, I would engage it conceptually. And the second is more of a question rather than a suggestion. The question is, have you seen any directors of these NGOs actually end up running for mayor, which would, I think, support your theory?
Thank you. My question is for Gautam. I like the paper very much, but there's one thing that troubles me somewhat, which is the costly action you suggest is organizing a petition to your local congressperson, right? Well, the way Congress is in the United States, this is like banging your head on a brick wall, isn't it? So maybe there's some other form of costly action could have been more insightful.
Can you just pass it to John?
This is for Shmuel. you're contrasting your proposal to the kind of cosmopolitan proposal, but it seems to me you're further to the right than Nozick, because the neo-Lockean proposal that Nozick has says that it's all right to take a piece of property that's not owned by somebody else and appropriate it as long as you leave others at least as well off as they would have been without the appropriation. Now, if it's a small country, it certainly can take the oil and if it makes its citizens better off, if it's democratic control, they'll be better off, and nobody else will be worse off because there's plenty of oil left in the world for others to appropriate. That doesn't even need the neo-Lockean proviso, just the Lockean one. On the other hand, if a dictator takes it, he's making his own people worse off because right. Okay. So you're proposing something even more conservative than that, namely that the country does have a property right over this as long as they develop it in the interest of their own citizens.
Please feel free to respond to the questions, but if you could just move the microphone towards you, that would be great.
Should we take it in what order do you want to proceed?
Maybe in the order they were asked. Yeah, I think that's.
So in that case, you were asked that, right?
Yeah. Well, for Paul's question, actually in the paper I do engage a little bit with why do I think this is not about clientelism or corruption. One thing I do for corruption is just cross-check whether or not these organizations that are receiving money are engaged in corruption, and there's a great data set for that, luckily. And I can check whether or not they actually did corruption with that type, pass money to political parties or use it in the ways they shouldn't be using it for this type of service provision. And in clientelism, it's harder to get at that, but it's mostly, I'm looking at public goods. It's not there's a kind of conditional contingent delivery of services that people have to, then are going to be, they're going to receive contingent on who they vote for. I think I love to answer your questions, but I think time.
Maybe. I think if you feel it, so let's answer the question.
Running for office.
Yeah.
Oh, right, running for office. Yeah, it's actually I'm doing right now, so I'll know in a couple of months. Yeah.
Maybe let's ask the questions that have come from the floor, and then at the end, if we have time for you to respond to Michael's comments, then we'll give you time to do that. Does that sound okay? Just the comments that have come from the audience.
So to John's question, this gets into slightly technical, philosophical territory, but the very short version is that they basically operate under the assumption that all Lockean and neo-Lockean views of property are a non-starter. So this whole idea of like living enough and is good for others is fundamentally unmotivated, and the Lockean machinery that assumes that you have anything like pre-political property is a myth. This is kind of broadly Rawlsian idea that I'm trying to work with, but I very much share the concern about kind of an excessive conservatism in this endorsement of national ownership. And in the broader project, part of the idea there is, again, another way of arguing against philosophers who think about, let's have this vision of perfect justice that's fixed and work from there, is to have a more pragmatic, flexible understanding of things, including of things like property. So we may endorse national ownership contingently in the world that we actually inhabit for these pragmatic purposes, but in some stage too, that might differ, that might change. So we can get into the details later on.
Were there any, you had a...
Yeah, so in terms of like the petition writing, maybe I could have picked a better measure. It's just something that people use a lot. And actually just to get to the point that you made, which is that the results maybe are not that strong. And the claim that I make in the paper is that to the extent that this changes people's minds, it's likely to reduce opposition, but not going to create political pressure from below to change any policy. But you're right, it also incorporates people's beliefs about the effectiveness of a petition. So that's it.
Yes, Pasha? Alan has some. Go ahead.
This question is for the Nili paper, but I just want to echo Michael's point. These are 4 really fantastic projects. I'm looking forward to kind of reading them. Each, even though they're outside of my field, some of them, but they sound like very interesting and very, very cool projects. My question is more actually a suggestion. I mean, there's a question probably somewhere in there, but really, there's an interesting case of this distributional justice within oil, where they are literally taking tankers of oil from one place and just giving them somewhere else. And this is Hugo Chavez's Petrocaribe program. And he literally did this, shipping oil from Venezuela to help out in this Bolivarian idea of helping our poor friends. But the problem, though, is that that was not altruistic, right? And so the idea being that maybe the distributional justice, there could be a side of that, which is, this could help improve your standing in the UN and improve your standing diplomatically. Yeah. So there is some motivation for it. But it's an interesting case. I don't know if it does fit into your story, but
it's really interesting.
So there are actual examples of little tankers going somewhere else. And of course, we'll see if that program continues. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think while you respond, we'll go back to Will and then to Victor. If you want to respond.
It's just a really interesting point, and I would certainly consider, I didn't know the case. Though, very quickly on Michael's point, thank you for bringing it up, because it wasn't at all my intention to impute that kind of claim to the kind of cosmopolitan foil. So if the text does give that impression, I should correct that. So thanks for pointing it out.
Yeah?
Well, thanks for the paper, Shmulik. I have a related question that ties into your broader project on liberal identity and global justice. I was wondering if you could maybe address the way your paper and your larger dissertation project reconciles the question of priority in terms of liberal identity and what you refer to as neo-colonial practices. Now, I'm not expecting, an in-depth prescriptive plan for how to deal with all the many numerous contradictions in the global political economy, but what you call, I'll briefly quote you since I've been following your project for a while, we've been talking about it, but you go on to say liberal polities that have struggled to overcome their own past as colonialists, for example, should all else equal prioritize ending those forms of global complicity that are most clearly neo-colonial practices, from natural resource trade with kleptocrats to purchases of sweatshop goods. Now, from my perspective, that doesn't really strike me as necessarily being rooted in liberal identity. It seems that this line of thinking would imply autarkic nationalisms, pan-nationalisms, alternative types of federalism, and other forms of non-alignment. Bolivar's sort of ideology was mentioned earlier. In this case, I don't think we're really looking at a liberal project in terms of whatever prescriptive implications might follow from your work, at least not at the level of the international system and international trade. But when we're looking at the relations of exchange and production that you're speaking of, third worldist ideas actually come to mind. So rather than John's comment earlier that's far on the right, the implications for me seem like they're more on the left. It seems that the implications would be that some sort of radical solidarities popularized throughout the global south based on, say, like Maoism and Bolivarism, rather than liberalism, is the ideological identity of exchange and relation from what follows from your prescriptive plan. And we can talk about this a bit more further. I have some other points, but I believe there's another hand.
Thank you, Will. Shmulik, would you like to take a moment to respond to that? Or?
Very quickly, there's so much there, and thanks for thanking in such detail. Just very, very quickly, William was referring to this idea of liberal identity. Much of my work tries to think about in what way we can talk about liberal democracy as a kind of agent that has integrity. In a sense, it parallels the integrity of an individual person, and how that kind of integrity might be imperiled by certain kinds of tainted global dealings. And dealings with the Obiangs of the world would presumably be one example of that. I have no hope of answering your question within 60 seconds. I will just say very quickly that I think about this notion of identity or moral identity as playing a role alongside more standard normative arguments about the rights of other peoples. So very briefly, if take a kind of the Putin case that I've discussed with Janik several times, so we may think that Putin is stealing, Putin and his cronies are stealing the natural resource wealth of the Russian people. And that's a right claim that has some potential implications for actions for us. But we should be concerned about the negative consequences that might befall the right bearers themselves, the Russian people themselves, if we stop dealing with Putin tomorrow morning. And one way to think about this identity idea, if it can be a separate moral factor in our reasoning, is to still push us, despite these conflicting impulses, to stop thinking about customary trade as the kind of moral default and rather think about it as a moral anomaly. So identity comes in to shift us not just towards reform. How does that look? We'll leave that for later conversation. Thank you for the question.
I think Victor is next, and Alan, Susan, Rosaka, I think has a question.
Yeah, these were all terrific. I really liked all of them, but I'm going to pick on Paul and Oscar because I thought that was just amazing. I mean, your patience and the research design. It got me thinking about the political economy of bureaucracy and the incentive structure that bureaucrats face. So I have two questions on that. Hopefully it'll stir further thoughts. Maybe you guys could work on another paper that could maybe address these or think about them. Because I don't think necessarily the paper you have now, as Michael said, maybe you don't want much more facts. So further extensions here. The first is, so what's the counterfactual? In terms of, if I'm a bureaucrat and there's a new policy, and I'm in charge of implementing it, and it's uncharted territory. So how would things look like, how would they be different if it wasn't FOIA, but some other thing foisted upon me that's very time-intensive or new? I would just like to know if the predictions are going to be different about compliance or non-compliance from the bureaucrat's perspective. Why does this matter? This is the heart of why I've learned a lot from your paper, and I think you guys should try to address the alternative mechanisms for a bureaucrat. So I'm faced with some new protocol, and I have to figure out by my bootstraps how to do it, because I didn't get much instruction from the powers that be. The first idea that comes to mind is opportunity costs. I have a lot on my plate. This is cognitively and administratively taxing. So I might just not be able to do it, not because of the will or because of some other thing about intentions, but really just about logistics or about costs. So the second is lack of accountability. I'm not going to get in trouble. I can just ignore this stuff. And maybe it's connected to opportunity costs because I will focus on stuff where I am accountable, but maybe not. So I'm not sure if these blend into each other. The third is lack of public spiritedness. I just don't care. I'm cynical. I could care less about the public good, or even if I do, it's not strong enough. So what I think would be really cool from your research design, if you were to do this again in another 8 years, is if you can use the overtime difference in compliance and the excuses and how they change, or the frequency of excuses to adjudicate these three mechanisms. Because I think this would add a lot of value to the political economy of bureaucracy, because I still think we don't understand what bureaucrats are going through and what they're thinking about and what the trade-offs are. And I think these could be different enough, these three mechanisms, where it behooves us to know, right? So if you could get leverage or exploit the excuse-making and the overtime differences, here's an idea. Over time, the opportunity cost thing would be less salient because maybe you have new resources or learning by doing at the margin decreases the cost of compliance, right? And so therefore you'd expect higher compliance over time, which I believe you guys find, right? So I don't know what the answer is, but I think you guys have unlocked a potential here for big, big questions about bureaucracy and how you get reform. And I think it very much boils down to individual bureaucrats and what kind of incentive structure they face. So that's
Oscar.
Thanks for the comments. Definitely really interesting. And it's definitely along the lines of what Paul and I are thinking of, like future steps for this research. Just a couple of things on, so getting at the mechanisms, that's something we've talked a lot. Definitely opportunity costs. Definitely, I think FOIA is an interesting example because it created this whole infrastructure to answer citizen requests for information, whereas this whole new agency, each government ministry agency had to include another, like embed the transparency office within its office to answer all these requests. So there was definitely a lot of learning by doing at first. So that could definitely explain part of the variation, the opportunity cost. But also, I guess there's the other opportunity cost of like, why should I answer this opportunity request from like X citizen? Like it's not, there are some punishments for not answering information, but a lot of times citizens don't follow through with the request, so it's not that likely that you're going to lose your job for not answering requests. So it could happen, and there are like fines and everything if a citizen pursues a claim that hasn't been answered. With regards to the public spirit, is one thing we saw, we also collected data, descriptive data of the offices and how often the directors and the people in charge of making the information answering the information requests, how often they disclose their own personal information. And Mexico has a website where all politicians and government members have to disclose their income and all their wealth. Only like 25% of the directors do that. And of the people working in the transparency office answering the questions, only about like 17% do that. So definitely the public spiritedness, it's not that high among the people there. And with regards to the excuses, like one of the things I've been thinking is like sort of learning within the bureaucracy. So it's like which excuses are acceptable, which ones are not. Are citizens gonna complain about this excuse if it's like too blatant, or is this like a subtle excuse? Is it subtle enough that they won't complain about it? So there's definitely like something like that going on. Or is it from the citizen side also, like are citizens more active in asking for more information and not accepting excuses as often? Thanks.
So for you, that point about people misestimating how big the foreign aid budget is a kind of an artifact of many of the some of the deliberative polls that Jim Fishkin has carried out. I mean, and it's very, one of these things that was videotaped, you know, you've got people being asked exactly what you said, how big do you think the foreign aid budget is as a share of the national budget? And they're saying things like, 20%. And do you think it's too big? Oh yeah, we think it's too big. What do you think it should be? Oh, 3%. I mean, so that fact is out there in some of the things that he's done, and I'm wondering, and what you're doing is almost like a baby deliberative poll, because it's the information that's being provided is very simple, it's very clear. That there might be some links, so you might want to explore what he's.
What's the name?
James Fishkin used to be here a long time ago. He's at Stanford. And that whole exercise of deliberative polls is worth thinking about relative to what you're doing. And Shmulik, I was somebody, I guess it was John, was seeing what you were doing as having this aspect of it that was very pragmatic. Right? Right. I mean, that I don't think you're really disagreeing with the idea that just because you happen to have gold under your backyard, you have some moral. You're not morally entitled to it. You could say, well, if you knew it was there and you paid for it. There's some property rights questions, but it's not. I don't think you're really disagreeing at some level with those claims. It's just you're making some arguments about the relationship between the resources and the institutional capacity that is a human choice to make these things valuable, and you want to bring those things together. So it's partly this question: is that right? And third, I completely agree about your thing about and Paul's about bureaucrats. I think you could see this as an entry wedge into thinking more generally about bureaucratic motivation. And I'm thinking particularly in the Mexican case, the one special thing about that, unlike the U.S., is that you've got an agency there. It's not just all the individual ministries set up their own things. They set up an agency. There's a whole big thing. Now, you could ask, how much does that matter? There's a structure that's been created, some specialized people to do it, and how much of it is other things that are motivating people to do or not do stuff. So I think it is something with legs that would be interesting to see.
Great. So I think some time for brief responses to that, and we're just about out of time for this panel. So if you can take a turn and say any concluding remarks you'd like to make based on the comments you've gotten, that'd be great. But just briefly.
I'll just definitely look at the deliberative poll stuff. It's really going to be useful. Thank you.
I never seem to remember the sequence here.
Me neither.
Thank you. I guess in the most basic level, my intention was simply to show that the classic claim in this literature, treating natural resource wealth, rather than thinking just about natural resource endowments, thinking about natural resource wealth as morally arbitrary, is more complex, is rendered more complex by attention to the social science literature. So the institutions have to intervene.
Yeah, thanks for all the great ideas. And it's definitely like the big, broad question behind this is like what makes like the bureaucrats tick and like what motivates them to comply to whether it's a FOIA law or another type of law. And just to one comment made earlier by Michael, it's like the news are really good news. I feel we always go like back and forth between like, oh yeah, this is really good, like about 80% are answering, but then we get feedback from people from Mexico, wait, but that means like 20% are not answering the request, like that's unacceptable. So yeah, so we always like have that struggle between that, but I mean I agree there, it's great news for EFI that so many of the agencies in Mexico are answering, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement as well.
Did you want to say anything just to wrap up?
Yeah. So, well, just going back to Michael's first comments, and well, if I could have it my way, coalitions would have an effect as well, but it is what it is. I do find like similar effects in terms of sign. It's just it's not statistically significant, so I can't really say much. But I mean, just thinking about it, then later can kind of come up with like I have some explanations why that would be the case. Why in coalitions that wouldn't see as larger effect, or at least it'd be noisier. That's what I seem to find, noisier effects. It's just that federal coalitions in Brazil, as we are seeing right now, are really messy. And especially when you're trying to match up federal coalitions with local coalitions, then there's really little overlap. It's really hard to really map on how governments operate at the central level and the local level. And about briefly, just the overall like net value of money that goes to those municipalities, it actually goes down for opposition places. So even though they are receiving more non-state transfers, the overall amount of money that's going there is going down. So overall public provision of goods is going down in those places.
Wonderful. Well, I want to just thank all the panelists, and also we're about out of time for this panel, and then we have some concluding remarks, and we have a really wonderful reception plan. So I'll just let you know that these doors will open at some point, and inside those doors are drinks and appetizers and all sorts of wonderful things. So if you're not seeing them set up, it's because we've hidden them from you strategically until this is over. So I was thinking of comparing the panels, and that we've had some really wonderful people present over the course of today, and I would urge all of you to keep your eye on our graduate students here. They'll be finishing soon and out in the world publishing and doing all sorts of fantastic things. I also wanted to extend a very special thanks to Michael Ross. You'll notice that I made him go first and last today, and he flew all the way out from LA to be here. So at the reception, feel free to also pass on your thanks for the extra duty that he did in discussing all of these papers in addition to presenting first. I also wanted to make sure, some people I think missed the announcement about there's an edited volume on economics in the environment. And if you're interested, you can email me directly, and I will put you in touch with the organizers. They are accepting contributions to this volume, and I think a lot of the interest that people share in this room, maybe you'd be motivated to write something new based on some of the things that have been discussed, or if you have something already that you think might be appropriate, you're welcome to contact me directly, and I will facilitate contact with the other folks associated with the edited volume. I also want to remind everyone, this is just logistically very briefly, that during the reception we will sort of have some time to chat, stretch our legs, get a glass of wine, whatever is your preference, and then we will have a musical performance where we'll come back in and sit down and listen for a little bit, which I think will be a very nice part of the reception. Although I have to say, at academic conference, we don't normally get such things. So you might not be used to doing something like this, but we're trying it out here, and I hope it's something that's very enjoyable for everyone. I know that I'm very much looking forward to it. With that, I'm going to close this session. You guys are welcome to stay here if you want to go back out, but I'm going to ask Alex Cooley to come to the front, maybe give some concluding remarks for us, because he knows this issue area better than I do, and I'm very happy to have him be doing this. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Susan. So I'll be brief here, and we've had such a rich and stimulating day. I mean, I think first and foremost, thank you, Graciela and Jeffrey, your family and friends. Thank you for your ideas, your spirit, your strength. This has been just a tremendously rewarding event to be associated with, and we feel really privileged and honored to have been here and to have supported this. Thank you to the Macmillan Center, and thank you to Susan for everything you've done. You've been thanked, but we'll thank you again because this is logistically something that's not easy, but certainly it's been worthwhile doing. It struck me during the course of the day, not only that when we talked about all the ideas that Natasha had that were brought together, ideas about sovereignty and about the resource curse, about area studies and countries and revolving doors and IFIs and so forth. But really, this is a special event just because it brought together a lot of qualities we normally don't have at gatherings like this. So, you know, on the one hand, you can say it was interdisciplinary, but I would say Natasha was more multidisciplinary, right? I mean, she did, you know, economics and political science and law, political theory, you know, normative commitments, activism, and this was really the spirit of the day's proceedings. You know, this deep, I think, ethical commitment to those on the receiving end of a lot of institutional forces that are out of control, to our planet, to all of our societies, and just the pressing issues that keep recurring. And then I think just this deep commitment to engaging scholars and practitioners, those who do both. And ordinarily in our settings, again, while we might not be completely siloed, we wouldn't have this rich opportunity for interactions and just, you know, the connections that we've made. So certainly Natasha's ideas will live on, and they're, I think, very influential and very insightful and go forth in various places of publication. But I think just the spirit that we engaged in, prompting us all to probe further, to question, to research, and really just to connect, to keep connecting with each other, really for me is the take home. So thanks again to everyone, especially for the out-of-towners who came from so far away. And we're looking forward to staying in touch and this wonderful reception, I guess the concert that will follow. Thanks again.